you hate the thought of working past 55 or 60? Do you hate not being able to live the life you deserve today? Do you hate not knowing what your financial future looks like? It's time to stop doing what you hate. Here's your host, Mr. Harold Green.
Aloha, everybody. This is Harold Green of Beneficiary Financial Group, and it is time to stop doing what you hate. Hope you are having a fantastic day today. Doing pretty good. Was up kind of early as usual because I just had to get some stuff off my chest. And before I would just do my shows ad lib, but now I kind of write them out because what it does is it just helps me stay focused throughout the whole show. And but today I got up early and went to Starbucks, got my coffee, and it's kind of cold up here in Las Vegas, but because the wind wasn't blowing, it was actually pretty nice outside, sitting outside. So I sat outside, had my cup of coffee, and did some research. And then finally the sun came up, so I said, let me get back home and record the show because I just gotta put it out there. And it's been a very interesting week, and I'm gonna get into my research here in a second. But the title of the show was The Philosophy of Debt versus Leverage. And I'm going to give you guys some historical data and context on bond yields and GDP and inflation and different things like that, because there's a lot of crazy things going on in the world today. And I think we need data to kind of help sort a lot of it out. But long story short, what I did to really help myself over the last, I would say it's been about a month now, I totally shut down social media. And I just got tired of it. I just got tired of reading about all the different mind viruses that people are infected with. And, when you're on social media, I would say it like this. If you have a social media team and they're just taking your information and putting it out there and writing posts for you, that's fantastic. But if you're on it all the time using it, you can be infected with stuff and not even be aware of it, totally oblivious to it. And I was talking to a good client of mine that we've been together for years and years and years, and he's a world famous person, and I can't say his name, but he's famous all over the world. People know who he is, and I said, I really feel like our country is turning into a place where we're not recognizing it anymore just because of the things that people say and do and the way they think about things. And it's totally disconnected. And when we look in the financial markets, I'm starting to see similar patterns where things are totally disconnected. It doesn't make a lot of sense. So it's making it a little bit difficult to figure out entry points, exit points, and things like that. And, and I'll talk to you about that in a second. But I want to dedicate today's show to my clients who have trusted me to help them steer clear of the financial mind viruses and the financial booby traps that are out there for you. So you ready? 1, 2, 3, let's get it. I want to talk about the philosophy of debt versus leverage, but I want to give you a little bit of history on my background. When I was growing up as a kid, we couldn't really afford debt. We were in the situation where we had what we had by the grace of God and the kindness of others, and what we could work to get. We weren't rich or anything like that. We didn't have any credit cards because we couldn't afford credit cards. We didn't have credit, so you couldn't really get credit cards. And I vaguely remember my stepdad having a truck payment because my mom and dad fought about it. That's when it comes to bills and stuff, sometimes when you don't have a lot of money, things get a little bit heated, things get tense, and it causes a lot of consternation. So my knowledge of debt increased immensely when I was trying to figure out how to get rid of it myself. And I learned everything I possibly could about debt elimination until I met one man, and that one man was Mr. Bob Harrison. And I met him at a seminar. We paid lots of money to go because I was really trying to figure out how to get myself from where I was to where I am right now. But man, it cost a lot of money to just load up my family, fly to Maui, and attend one of the seminars. We ended up staying at the Ritz-Carlton. I rented a nice car. I mean, we were really just like, if you want to see what being wealthy is about, you got to be around wealthy people and see how they do it. And Mr. Harrison, he did it big. He brought in some of the top wealthiest Christian people in the country who ran businesses who made tons and tons of money, and they just talked about how they did it. And long story short, he introduced me to the word leverage and the difference between leverage and debt. So a key question before we get started is, are you in debt or are you leveraged? How are you looking at that? So I want to talk about the housing market crash of 2008 and the subprime mortgage debacle. This was a disaster of great proportion. It was an example of what happens when you try to make things affordable for people who don't qualify the traditional way. It was also one of the greatest wealth transfers in history. People with little to no credit were getting loans on multiple properties with no real income. I know this for a fact because I interviewed people who did this and I saw their financials because they came into my office for financial advice. And they had all this stuff and they were like, okay, what's my next move? And blah, blah, blah. I'm like, how the hell did you get all this? And they said, this is what's out there. Mortgage brokers earn billions in fees, as well as the subprime lenders. And this crash, man, this was almost overnight. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of segue into the historical context of what was happening back then. So back in 2006, I started telling people about what I think was coming. And I encourage people to start building up cash reserves outside of what they considered the golden geese at that time, which was low interest lines of credits, like home equity lines of credit. And my thoughts were, if this many people got into a situation where they couldn't pay, the house of cards would like really come crashing down. And that's exactly what it did. So let's get into it for a second. So I want to go back into 2007 and just kind of talk about where the federal funds rates were, where bond yields were, and where inflation, was at that time. And there's a narrative out there that the feds are trying to push about keeping rates higher for longer. And this is exactly what they did back in 2007. They kept the 2006, 2007, they kept interest rates elevated and it ended up causing a recession. And now they're talking about keeping interest rates elevated without causing a recession, but they're talking about a soft landing. And there's also a narrative out there that they need to start cutting rates as early as March of next year. But then on the backside of that, historically, when they started cutting rates, it's because we were either in a recession or headed towards a recession. So a lot of things aren't adding up. So I want to go back to September of 2007. Bond yields, and this is the 10-year bond yield, and you can look this stuff up. It was 4.56%. If we want to know what bond yields are today, it's basically the 10-year is 4.18. So 2023, okay, fast forward, a little bit different here, 4.18, okay? And we're in December. So I'll catch you up here in a second. But in December of 2007, bond yields were 3.89. So we're not too far away from being 3.89. Now, what was inflation back then? Inflation back then in September was 2.76%. But what was the federal funds rate? It was 4.96%. Why was it so high when inflation was only 2.76%? Aren't these things supposed to match up? They're supposed to, but I guess they thought inflation was going up and it did. Inflation was going up and it went up to 4.08%, right, in December of 2007. But the federal funds rate is 4.66%. Fast forward to just a quarter later, right, April of 2008. This is when the market is starting to tank. I mean, it's crazy. GDP was going down. As a matter of fact, we had very, very little GDP for 2008. In 2009, we had negative GDP. It was just stupid. And so April of 2008, 3.57% was bond yields, the 10-year. But the Fed, they had started cutting rates, 2.38%. But inflation was higher than that, 3.94%. So these things aren't adding up. We're headed towards, we're in a recession at that point. So October, what do we have? Bond yields, 3.77. The federal funds rate was 1.15, cutting rates more. But inflation was still at 3.66%. So inflation was high and we were in a recession, which is totally bad. I mean, a lot of people lost a lot of stuff, and including me and myself. I had to make some adjustments and I'll tell you about those in a second. October. So now we're in December of 2008. Bond yields are down 2.72, but the federal funds rate is 0.52 and inflation was 0.09. I mean, it had dropped We're in a recession. Nobody's buying anything. I mean, it was horrible at that point. And we're starting to go into negative GDP for 2009. So fast forward January 22nd, 2029, or 2009, bond yields were down to 2.62%, and federal funds rate 0.14 and inflation 0.03. So it took us a long time to kind of dig out of this. It took, I think, the S&P 18 months, or I'm sorry, 5 years to recover all those losses, right? And that was a very difficult period of time. So what I wanted to point out on all of this is you're going to hear a lot of stuff over the next, I don't know, 6 or 7 months. And personally, I do think the Fed ought to start cutting interest rates because I do think inflation is going to come down. I think inflation is going to come down a lot faster than some people think. Some people think inflation is going to stick around, and they think that if the Fed starts cutting interest rates sooner rather than later, it's going to cause inflation to go back up. Well, with layoffs and job losses, inflation probably is not going to go back up with that many people losing their jobs because it's predicted that the economy will slow. So, where are you right now? Where was I back then? And I wouldn't say I was a victim of this ordeal. It was the exact opposite. You had subprime mortgages, and we got one of these fancy deals that allowed us to buy our condo. It was expensive at that time. I mean, I think it was darn near $600,000. And today that's well over $1 million. Because I owned a business, the banks thought I was at risk for not being able to pay my loans. So what they did is they closed down my home equity line of credit, because what we did is we took out a home equity line of credit on the property. It was a weird deal where they gave you the down payment out of the home equity line. It was just one of these crazy loans, but at the time that's what we could qualify for. So what I did is when they closed my line of credit down, and it was one of those for Countrywide or whatever it was at the time that they got in trouble with these crazy loans. So I short sold the property and I rented the exact same property nearby for half the mortgage. I mean, I was saving a lot of money. And so what I did is I reinvested the rest of the money in my business. And then a year and a half later, I think it was about a half a year or a year later, I bought another property nearby, and it was super cheap at the time due to the values being depressed because people just couldn't get loans. So fast forward to today, there is a ton of people out there who can't move because they're stuck in low interest rates, and there's a shortage of homes because of it. So like, why would you move from a 3% loan to an 8% loan? It was just insane. And also, we're coming off one of the worst bear markets in history, and we're also coming off of one of the highest inflation periods in history. And nobody got rescued with the rescue plan except the rich. What do I mean by that? When treasury yields are up at 5%, like I said on one of my last shows, if you got $1 billion and you don't want to, you don't really need to invest it in the market and lose it. You could seriously sit in treasuries and just collect all day, like 4%, 5% guaranteed interest on short-term treasuries. It's basically where the rich got rich. And then what happened to the people with the credit card debt and the variable interest rate loans? I mean, they're the ones getting poorer because their interest rates are going higher, and they're paying more money to the banks for it. And again, the banks are getting tighter and tighter. Again, no one benefits from high inflation except the rich. And so when you start looking at all the different government programs out there that are like taking trillions of dollars and throwing it at different issues, it causes inflation. It's inflationary. And a lot of the economists know that. But some of them, they've gotten stuck in their political mind viruses, and they're not looking at doing what's best for the economy. They're not looking at doing what's best for the country. They're looking at doing what's best for themselves. And again, no one benefits from high interest rates except the rich. So back to my point of debt versus leverage. I think right now we're headed for a train wreck in the lending markets. And I'd like to speak to you on how you can protect yourself and your future. But first, what I want to do is look at some figures. Let's look at the debt that's out there. This is in no way leverage for a lot of people because they bought college degrees, or they bought access to college, and they got degrees that are just garbage. Our labor participation rate is the lowest it's been, I think, in 60 years. People have these highfalutin degrees, but they're not being productive. Student loan debt is at 1.78 trillion. Like when I started this whole college funding business that I was in before, in the late 2000s, it was approaching $1 trillion. So that's insane. Credit card debt is now over like 1 trillion. Get this, like from Q2 of 2021 until now, credit card debt went from under 800 billion to over $1 trillion. I mean, this is insane. The US economy is predicted to slow down, and defaults are already on the rise. Banks are being paid to tighten lending conditions. And I'm telling you, it's going to get worse before it gets better. And the only way I think that it will lighten up if the Fed just starts cutting rates. Because, I mean, credit card interest rates will go down. People will begin to move. It'll begin to loosen up the economy more. And it's better for everybody. So I want to discuss what it means to be in debt versus being leveraged. It's quite simple. Being in debt means you have no underlying assets as collateral for that debt. I mean, nothing. And being leveraged is the exact opposite of that. You do have an underlying asset backing that debt. And I would have to say not being in debt is super important due to the fact that most debt is consumer debt in nature. As you know, people have purchased depreciating assets, consumer goods with that debt, and there's no potential for the value of those items to increase, like car loans. Car loans are like, I understand people got to get around, man, but car loans, I mean, when I was growing up, like we were so broke, we would have to buy used cars. And before we could get the used car paid off, like it would break down. And then we'd have to like go carry that broken down car debt onto another car loan. And I remember my mom like just really struggling with that. And it was just horrible. And so I'm like, okay, I carried a little bit of that mentality of brokenness into my adulthood. And I was doing the same thing. I'd buy used cars and they would break down and now I would have to go buy another used car. Next thing you know, I'm like 20,000 in debt over 3 used cars and none of them are working. So that's why I had to make some big changes in my life. And I'm not saying you folks listening to me are like that. I'm saying I've met a lot of people like that. And there's ways that we can avoid that. And I think the key is having successful information put out to our kids when they're in elementary school about finances, middle school about finances, high school about finances, and college about finances. I believe there is a systemic effort to keep people in the dark on finances. And of course, you can learn things on your own, but the way society doesn't work that way. A lot of people are being manipulated into believing a lot of different crazy things. And I think instead of pushing those narratives, they can push and teach kids how to think for themselves when it comes to finances and understanding what goes into a situation. And that's why I wanted to put the show out so anybody can listen to it and understand what's going on. Okay. Now, I said all of that to say this: rates may have to stay elevated just so the banks can have a head start earning income to cover the losses. I mean, this is my conspiracy theory. All right. I'm just putting that out there. It's a conspiracy theory that I have in my head because banks are raking in tons of money right now. But in the future, what about these losses when people can't pay these credit cards? What about these losses when people can't pay their car payments? What about these losses when people can't pay some of the consumer debt or the personal loans that they've taken out? Who's going to cover that? If the government doesn't bail these banks out, it's going to have to come from the consumers themselves who can't afford it, right? So whatever they can't cover gets passed on to the rest of us in the form of high rates on different things. So here's some simple steps to make sure that you are not a passenger on that train. Now, I'm not advocating train wrecks or, I'm not making fun of train disasters or anything like that. I'm just making an analogy. So one of the things you want to do is you want to reevaluate your current credit positions. Check your equity lines to ensure your rates are locked in for another year or two. If they're not, I probably wouldn't be too alarmed unless you owe millions of dollars, right? Because then you are refinancing at higher rates. And that's one of the narratives that the Wall Street is pushing, and that corporate debt is going to have to be renewed. And if they have to renew it at higher rates, it's just going to be bad for the profits. Okay. So at that point, it becomes a matter of cash flow to make sure that the rate adjustments can be covered. So it's not complicated. You just got to make sure you're making enough money to cover the adjustments until interest rates come back down. The next thing you do is check the cash value in your life plans. And there may be enough there to help offset the remaining debt, to help offset the debt, meaning basically you borrow on your life insurance policies and pay off your home equity line of credit. I've done that before. And then once rates come back down, you can refinance the home equity line and then pay your life plans back. Because I do think, if they're looking at inflation being at somewhere at 2% in the next, maybe 1 to 2 years, then you got to understand that interest rates are going to come back down too. And banks are going to loosen up and they're going to start offering these crazy introductory rates, 1%, maybe 0.5% for a year. I believe we are going to see that again because I don't want to see a recession. That's all I can say about that. The next thing you want to do is reevaluate your portfolio and talk with your advisor or your professional about how 2008 impacted the stock market, and then see if you are at risk for something similar happening to you. And certain stocks got hammered. in 2008. I think we may be headed to a situation where people make what happened in 2008's market a reality for 2024's market just because of negative, I don't know, negative confessions or just negative outlooks that or projections and things that they're just pushing out there. And we got to be careful with that because you can get trapped in that mindset and the market starts to rally next year and you're sitting there on the sideline because you thought we're headed for a recession based on what you heard on financial TV. Now I'll say that because there's a total disconnect between our financial markets, meaning inflation is coming down, but rates are staying higher out of fear that lowering rates will cause inflation to rise again. I just said that. This will mean that inflation is not transitory at all. It will mean that inflation is sticky, but I don't think it is. The last thing to look at is your current earning power over the next 10 years. And is it expected to rise or are you at risk of being laid off? And are you able to simply walk away if things get too crazy at work? And I'm telling you, I'm getting, I don't know, probably 12 clients retiring in 2024 alone out of the, I don't know, few hundred that we have. And it's going to get, in the next 10 years, it's going to be more and more people that are just going to walk away because things are too crazy at work. And I'll put it to you like this, and I'm not advocating this, but a lot of people are working just to pay taxes. When you look at, I'm not kidding you, when you look at your paychecks, if you are a high W-2 income earner and your wife is a high W-2 income earner, your significant other is a high W-2 income earner, you are literally working to pay taxes. Your FICA tax, your Social Security tax, your Medicare tax, all that stuff goes away when you retire. And then also, if you're funding a lot of money in your 401k just to reduce the taxes, if you've invested well, you're probably sitting on $1.5 million to $2 million, which, you know, if you don't have a lot of debt and you're able to get decent returns in the market, you would be okay. Now, all investments do carry risk of loss, but you got to be working with somebody who's a proponent of that. And it's also okay just to like quit that job and then find something else to do that's not going to drive you crazy, because there are a lot of companies out there that are still hiring people that are seasoned. They know what they're doing. You know, older people, they're more invested in the outcome of the company. They're more invested in bringing value to the table. They've kind of lived life. They've been young. They've done all the crazy things they wanted to do. And now they're settled down and they can add value. Where some of the younger workers are not so much. There's a big disconnect between the millennial group and the Gen X group and the baby boomer group. It's just crazy. Now, if the US economy does go into a deep recession, question is this: what will that mean for you and your family? Do you have a strategy to ensure that you can continue to live life as you currently know it? Or are you going to have to do something drastic like sell your house at the wrong time, right? You get laid off at the wrong time. These are a lot of things that you're going to have to consider. Now, last thing I want to do, I want to look at leverage. Now, if you're a sophisticated investor or you just know how to manage money, I'm not really talking to you per se. This is just for people who have kind of done the ostrich concept. Like they go to work every day, they make good money, you know, they invest money, but they don't really pay attention to a lot of stuff. So I want to talk about leverage. Now, leveraging is a concept it's highly speculative, right? And it's risky. So before attempting to leverage in certain situations, you got to understand your risk tolerance, because leveraging does involve risk, and you're going to have to understand the risk and the investment horizons and whatever comes with that, right? Now, are you able to leverage certain assets in order to take advantage of potential opportunities in the market if things went bad, like in 2008? And if you knew there's a likelihood that there would be a moment in time where you could greatly increase your net worth and minimize your risk, like, would you do it? If you're sitting out there right now and you have the ability to open up a line of credit for, say, $1 million on one of your rental properties, or, you know, say you have a commercial property or whatever it might be, or, you know, you're renting out a duplex or whatever you may have, like, is there a possibility that you could take a line of credit for $1 million or whatever it is, and then if you saw the market tank, go in there and scoop up stocks, and then when the market recovers, cash in and then pay them off? That's a strategy that I've seen some people use, but it's only for the sophisticated investor. And the thing about it is, you know, real estate values only increase at a certain amount per year. What if you could leverage that another way? I do that in our rapid retire financial planning process. And I pose this question because I'm currently working with my clients to explore this. Some of them are very wealthy. Some are, some have assets that they can leverage. Now, in financial history, we have had opportunities to do this. However, the key to success of this has been the timing. And you have to prepare for these things. You can't just be like, oh my God, the market is really bad now. Let's go see if we can leverage things and scoop up. No, you can't do it at that time, because what if the banks aren't lending? What if you can't get that line of credit? And my thing is this: even if you have to take a line of credit at 8%, if there is no balance on it, you don't owe anything. But if you could jump in, buy something, and then make 20, 30, 40, 50% in a year or two, that 8% is not going to hurt you all that much, right? And you can write some of that off on your taxes. Now, this strategy, if implemented correctly, could be a game changer in your overall situation. I mean, we're talking like 10x. Again, there is no guarantee of return investing in the stock market. All investments do carry risk of loss. You have to understand the risk tolerance and make sure, like I said, if rates adjust and something goes bad, can you handle the payments, right? Do you have the cash flow? You're going to have to understand that this philosophy requires you to greatly understand balance sheets and how all of these things work. That's one of the things I do when I'm looking at the market and looking at different companies. I look at the balance sheets, and it just drives me bonkers when I see companies getting sold off and they got balance sheets that make them look like King Tut. I mean, it's insane, like Solomon level type of assets these companies have. I digress. Owing money to create more wealth is not a terrible thing if you do it inside a system. You have to do this inside a system. And Rapid Retire is the system that it's what we use to help people, right? It's cash flow management, income generation, cash reserve systems. And if you're interested in a system like this, how it would benefit you, look us up on the internet, drop us an email, give us a phone call, 808-521-4401, and see if it's worth exploring for you, because you could be leaving game-changing types of returns on the table by not understanding when to do a strategy like this. There are good times to do it. There's bad times to do it. But if we can figure out the exact timing of it, I mean, the worst thing that can happen is we're a little bit early. And that's what I tell my clients, right? They're like, oh my God, when do we get in? And back in September, October, I was getting in, we were early, because the thing with Israel happened, right? We were early to the party, and we took some hits because we were early. But guess what? November was fantastic, and we did great. And now there's a rotation going on, and we have to pay attention to it. And so these are some things that I want you to consider before we head into 2024. And if you think that we could put something spectacular in place for you, look us up. So I just wanted to put this out there for you folks today, the philosophy of debt versus leverage or whatnot. Hopefully you've learned something from this, and it's going to make a difference in your life. So until next time, everybody, 1, 2, 3, let's get it.
This is the podcastfactory.com.